We are back. It is a duo episode, and don't despair, individuals. When we have a duo episode, it's not because we didn't have any guests. It is because we are the only guests that really matter on our own podcast. Welcome to the only fatness podcast that matters. I'm joined with my illustrious co-owner, Eric. How you doing?
Happy to be here. Thanks for introducing me, my fellow co-owner.
Yeah.
That's all I got to say. I don't really have much of a personality. I just make my desk go up and down.
Hey, look, all I gotta say is that you trying to obfuscate for a lack of personality, or is that you emphasizing your innate personality? That's what we're talking about in today's episode, because this is a banter-filled episode. There'll be virtually no knowledge. We may have said something along the lines of periodization for hypertrophy. We got you. Congratulations. You're a sucker.
Mm-hmm. Primarily going to be discussing nihilism, 80s rom-coms, and perhaps our favorite bubblegum.
Ooh, yeah. But, I will say I'm all out of bubblegum, so I'm here to kick ass. And if you want an 80s rom-com, When Harry Met Sally, or Moonstruck is another great one. I'll go with that. If we're talking about nihilism, just to wrap up this episode, I will say that we're fighting against the void here on Iron Culture, as always, because there is a danger to be serious for a second, because I would say, Eric, that to be serious all the time implies that it excludes playfulness. But playfulness, on the other hand, if you want to know a bit about my personality, the concept of play does not exclude being serious. You could be serious, you could be playful and serious, but if your default position is to be serious, then maybe you're a little uptight. And that's what Iron Culture, we're exploring here, the void. We're trying to avoid in the void being too reductionist. I think individuals sometimes we want concrete, neat answers to fill our paradigm, and that's what we actually want to avoid in this conversation. We want to have a robust conversation that's far-ranging when it relates to periodization and hypertrophy. And sometimes we're all guilty of this because, let's face it, do you want to watch a 3-minute video, a 5-minute video, or listen to an hour podcast on a topic? We want those heuristics. We want to know, okay, Eric, yeah, you want to build some muscle. Okay, so here's the rep range. Here's approximately the amount of sets you got to do. Here's how many times you got to train per week. And here's what you got to do week to week. And that might work largely, but is it best for you? Questionable.
I think that's very well said. And if you wanted that hour-long podcast because you heard what Omar said and you're like, you know what, that makes sense. I do need a deeper dive. Well, guess what? We've never done an hour-long podcast. It's always longer than that. So you're going to get an even deeper dive than you could possibly want. Yeah. And please comment. Let us know that our podcast is too long. Yeah. And we will definitely
make it longer.
Yes. Yeah. We'll definitely go, you know what? Lean in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
No pivots.
To be honest, we don't respond well to criticism because we're only doing this for ourselves. And this is really just an excuse for Eric and myself to hang out.
I think we respond really well to criticism. You criticize us, and if you actually leave a name that we if we can figure out who you are, or what your email is, we're gonna send you a review of your review. We're gonna rate you, just a person rating, and we'll post that regularly. I think we should do that. Yeah. Start rating our ratings. Yeah. I don't have the time to do that, and I'm not actually going to do that, but it's a funny idea.
Yeah, and I don't want to threaten any individual, but I'll just say if you should leave a 1-star review on iTunes, we will assassinate you. I won't say the word, but I think everyone could figure out what I was saying. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I couldn't, but I think I agree.
Yeah. There's a lot of ass up in here, and maybe that's a good segue. That's not really a segue to talk about hypertrophy, talking about glutes, talking about periodization here, Eric. I think we had a fantastic episode on periodization. If you haven't listened to it, episode, I believe it's number 4, with John Kiley, Mike Tashir, and then also Mike Zordos, where we spoke about the concept of periodization. Before we go on into hypertrophy specifically, because oftentimes when people think of periodization, at least in the lifting world, it's synonymous with strength. Let's get a few definitions out of the way. Let's talk about what periodization is.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the definition for something always will be semi-flexible when we're talking about an applied concept, because the definition will shift a bit depending on the context and the application. So periodization, if you go back to Matveyev, was originally around to program long-term macrocycles in performance-based athletes, right? And hypertrophy was simply one phase of that, one element of improving performance. The idea that having more total muscle volume, more contractile tissue can eventually lead to force production being enhanced, which can eventually lead to power production. If force times velocity is power, and that power is typically the primary characteristic that an athlete cares about. And of course, there's a whole spectrum from force to velocity dominant power production. And, if you're a strength athlete, you're going to be much more on the force side of it. If you're just moving your body through space or a very lightweight implement, you need more on the velocity side of it. So when you look at some of the definitions of different periodization models, specifically going back to kind of the beginning of periodization, you get these relatively complex ideas, terms, and then more complex would be the systems themselves. But I think if we want to really break down periodization to its kind of easiest understandable, most simplistic constituent parts, which allows us to discuss its theory for being applied to different things in performance, like hypertrophy, like we're going to today, I think a really good definition just comes from Buford, 2007, that it's just the manipulation of training variables to improve performance.
Yeah.
And when you use that simple of a definition, this is one that Mike Zardos likes to use as well. He and I agree on that, so it must be true. Then, man, a lot of things can qualify as periodization. With that said, I do think there are some important distinctions. So, for example, the terms programming, periodization, and progression are often used sometimes interchangeably or have overlapping usages, but they do have distinct meanings. And I think it's important to be able to distinguish between them so that you can be more clear and know what you do and maybe don't have to do. Because I think sometimes I was mentioning to this off air, that when we become aware that there are many variables that relate to an outcome, the temptation, especially by analytical sciencey types, is to want to try to manage and manipulate all of those variables. However, in physiology, we're always looking, not always, I'm sure there will be some time in the future where this percentage will go up. I'm going to give you an arbitrary number here. We're looking at like 20% of the whole puzzle and making inferences and doing the best we can. But there's always these feedback loops, redundant systems. We're layering a lot of selection and evolution to get to the human structure we see today. So when the more variables you try to manage, those are also more potentials for compounding errors, and you layer assumptions atop of one another. So this is where the use of the heuristic is quite useful. Like you mentioned before, heuristic just being a mostly true simplification of something that allows action in the face of complexity, I think is a good way to put it.
Yep.
And it's easy for a heuristic to become false if it makes too many assumptions or if it simplifies something too much. So in essence, what I think we need to talk about is the difference between those three things: progression, periodization, and programming as they relate to hypertrophy. But
no, we'll definitely talk about those three P's where people use it interchangeably. I could already hear, and again, our podcast, to be serious for a second, we got the cult. Okay, this is Iron Culture. The people that are already on board, but we are growing every single week where there's new listeners. I could already hear one of the potential things that an individual would say is like, well, wait a second, Eric. Okay, if we only know a certain amount of information, right? So we don't have the full view of things, and if sometimes there could be deleterious effects when I try and manipulate some of these variables. Well, I don't even know what's actually going to happen. I think I might, but we don't know. Then we could reduce it. It's like, so if it's not useful, in quotations, we just need to train hard. And I joke when I say this, like that's I'm reducing someone else's position. So in ways, I'm being a reductionist. But we hear that opposition, let's say, to trying to understand programming or trying to understand anything when it comes to training other than intensity being defined as the amount of effort that you put into the gym, either the weight you're lifting or how close you approach failure, however you define intensity. I think for those individuals that are thinking like that, I would say that the more we understand that science isn't, or what we currently know isn't something that can be disproven, where it's all these things, wait a second, okay, we only know this, therefore it's completely junk. It's a useful guide. And I go back to Mike Teixeira when he was talking about periodization, which I loved his analogy about having a map. in a cave, and I'm going to keep referencing it because it was when he said it, it was kind of a mic drop moment. Having a map that might not be true, but in a cave, so how to get out of there, and it's completely dark, and the biopsychosocial model or the rocks moving around, so everything inside the cave is constantly moving, but you have a little pen light, which is kind of your own feedback loop of what's going on, and your program that you have laid out before you is the map, and the map might not even be right, but by having a map, it makes you feel more safe. And if you can't understand that analogy, that's okay. All this to say, talking about these things will enhance our ability, I think, to train better overall, long game, long term. So let's talk about then the 3 Ps: programming, progressive overload, and periodization, and what those differences are.
Yeah. So for one, I think I gave the most simplistic definition of periodization, and I think that's about as simple as you can get. You can get it, and some people would even argue with it because the word period is in periodization. Okay. So that means we're looking at a time component, and I think probably a definition that is a little less loose that everyone could agree with for periodization would be that, yeah, we're manipulating variables to improve performance over time. Now, the reason why I don't feel the necessity to add that over time is because we exist in a world where there's time. So if I'm saying we're going to improve performance, unless you assume that I mean right now, what variables can I manipulate right now to improve, which kind of requires some like willful ignorance of like the general adaptation model and understanding that we adapt, it's largely just a semantic addition, in my opinion. But that time component is then specific to the goal. And so periodization has evolved over time. The original Western model, or the linear model as it's called, was protracted over multiple months, sometimes a full Olympic cycle. And you would spend multiple months in these different phases. Like I talked about, the traditional approach is to go through kind of a work capacity and hypertrophy phase, maybe muscular endurance is tied up in there, and then to go through force development, maximal strength development, all kind of the same thing. And then eventually getting to power, and that's where you peak, taper, and compete. And those are kind of the drawn-out elements. If you look at the various iterations and quote-unquote theoretical improvements on that original model, they're all related to managing different time courses of competition. So, for example, powerlifting is not an Olympic sport. People compete 3 times a year. So you want to perhaps truncate those things so that they fit into multi-month periods between meets so that you can peak for 2 to 3 to 4 meets per year. Additionally, you don't really care about quote-unquote power, right? So if you look at Dr. Zerdos's dissertation, what he looked at was power, quote-unquote, as it relates to a power lifter, which is almost always talking about something on the force end of that spectrum. And essentially, he said, all right, well, the daily undulating model, which is basically a very truncated microcycle version of that Western model, where on different days we might go hypertrophy, strength, then power. That is designed so that at the end of the week or the end of this mesocycle, microcycle, or macrocycle, power is the final phase and the end point that we're trying to achieve, but we care about force. And then practically, what we could do, is we put that strength day after the power day. And the power day, if it's more force dominant, would be low volume, basically heavy practice. So like singles at 80% is a decent example of what that might look like for a powerlifter. It would, of course, look different for a different type of athlete. But because power is generally work that is at a higher velocity, and it is not requiring like heavy eccentrics or a ton of volume to do, there's a very small damage component, right? So you're incurring less fatigue and less muscle damage, so that if you put that before the strength day, you might be more recovered and maybe even primed to perform well. And that's exactly what he found. More volume was performed on the strength day, better strength outcomes overall. So these manipulations of that initial concept of the model of periodization are all just basically sport specific or goal specific. Another example would be just using a block model. So you have a volume block, an intensification block, and a taper. That's essentially the block periodization model in more colloquial terms. And that's the same model, just truncated, and you could do that over even a 9-week period. You could fit that together. Going back to what I said about undulating, there's weekly and daily undulating. And this is a way so that you don't lose adaptations over these multi-month periods. If you train for hypertrophy for 3 months and train for strength for 3 months, you're going to start to get some detraining effects on your work capacity and maybe even muscle size. However, if you keep some higher rep, higher volume work, within a block where you're primarily doing strength work, then you're going to hold on to those adaptations because it requires a lot less work to maintain an adaptation than it does to reach peak levels where you're really having to produce overload. So when you look at the basic model, the single concept is that it is linear over time. Essentially, volume comes down and then intensity comes up. At least that's the case for expressions of force and power. That may not be the case if you are like a marathon runner using periodization. You're going to be adding miles, and then eventually you'll drop miles as you increase the pace. But there's going to be a period where the volume goes up longer than, or further and longer than you might expect, and then the intensity of that volume goes up because you're trying to build to the point where you can do 26 miles. Yeah. So anyway, the application of this concept is goal specific, and this is where hypertrophy gets quite interesting, in that we're not trying to maximize force, we're not trying to maximize power. In fact, in many ways, you could argue that hypertrophy is not a sport-specific adaptation at all. Although you might see it in your personal training textbook, this rep range, this rest period, this tempo, this number of sets, these exercises, and that's hypertrophy, that's muscular endurance, that's power, that's whatever. The reality is that hypertrophy is almost a side effect of being able to produce more work and produce more force. The components of what grows in a muscle are multifaceted, although we kind of simplify it. Like, the muscle getting bigger, it's stronger. Well, you also have a strong volume relationship with hypertrophy. So it's the ability to do lots of fatiguing contractions is essentially at a relatively high force level that produces an actual slowdown of what you see. Like, you're actually training to fatigue with resistance training or somewhere near it. And I don't mean to failure necessarily. So hypertrophy is the side effect of one being better able to do a whole lot of relatively quote unquote heavy contractions. Rather than it being the performance outcome, it is one of the components to strength, one of the components to quote unquote, high force work capacity, if you will. So that's where periodization needs to be very much rethought. Yeah. And that's why the other concepts as they relate to hypertrophy, programming and progression, become important. So programming, I think the best way to think of programming is the manipulation of variables over a shorter period. So in periodization, we have microcycles, which are typically about a week, a mesocycle, which is a small block of concrete training. And the microcycle and the mesocycle is where 99.9% of the fitness industry operates. That's what the programs you see that you're getting are. A macrocycle is typically the entire preparation for a sports competition. And it could be, like I said, 4 years for an Olympic athlete. It could be a year for someone training for world championships, etc. It includes stuff like time off, training in a different area, active recovery, and all of that. While the mesocycle is kind of like, what am I doing for this competition in a sports context, or for this max testing session if someone's not actually competing? So programming largely operates at the mesocycle and microcycle level. That might be, how do you modify rest periods, number of sets, exercises, etc., all those acute training variables, while periodization is more about the manipulation of volume and intensity over time. And one thing that all the models that I discussed have is what's called linearity, which in general, like I said, is volume starting high or building up and then coming down as intensity goes up, so that you can drop fatigue and improve fitness in the most specific way. Like, a power lifter will start doing more accessory work. They will do more total volume. They'll train in higher rep ranges. They'll do not just the big three, because they may not be the best vehicles for doing a lot of volume, because they're quite demanding. And then as they get closer and closer to competition, the total volume comes down, but the loads go up, the rep ranges go down, the sets come up to compensate, and there's more of an emphasis on the specific strength, while hopefully maintaining enough of the hypertrophy and work capacity so that you can get that peak of all the different things that contribute to strength on game day. So, with all that said, the issue with hypertrophy is that we're largely taking all of these models that were built for performance and kind of shoehorning it for the goal of a bodybuilder, and kind of looking at it like, right, bodybuilding, the goal is to be big, it's a sport, and you want to peak in that, and therefore we take hypertrophy and we create the same kind of model for it. But it's both more and less complex than that, because hypertrophy is not something that requires you to dump a bunch of fatigue. It's primarily a local phenomena, rather than the overall capacity of your body and kind of the total homeostatic state of your ability to perform. So that's kind of a long, rambling response, but that's the distinction between programming and periodization.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so many things to unpack, and that's why one of my, not fears, excitement is what I'd say. And doing this episode is we could go on forever, bro. And maybe there's going to even be a sequel because there are so many things to talk about. I'm picturing Medvedev when he first came up with, just some of these periodization models, and then someone's like, all right, check it out, bro. You thought I was going to be for weightlifting. I'm doing it to get swole. What's up? And he's like, this is not what I wanted. Like, please,
Exactly.
please do not do this. And that's an interesting distinction in and of itself, where if we talk about powerlifting, we talk about, aka what we like to call now around here, Eric, the low velocity boys. And we talk about, we don't need to move fast. You just need to move it. And weightlifting, they're trying to express that all the programming or all the periodization they do for macro cycle on specific lifts. First, as you said, a bodybuilder is trying to get maximum swole, localized areas that they're trying to improve over time. And maybe, is this correct in saying that you would put forth that obviously programming for hypertrophy is important as well as progressive overload, but periodization is one of those qualities we could take a deeper dive into, and it might be something that's a little bit more tenuous?
Yeah, there's a big question mark there, is whether we even need some of the concepts of periodization, or whether some of the concepts of periodization just end up being useful, but not because of the original proposed model. Like having different amount, like cycling volume, for example, might just be that what you need to do to induce overload also induces fatigue. We know that from the fitness fatigue model. So that means something like a deload might make sense. And if you string a bunch of mesocycles together with deloads, that's basically periodization. But it's not because I'm trying to then move into an intensity block necessarily. And I think as we understand the mechanisms of hypertrophy over time, then the picture gets even murkier. So, for example, when we used to have this idea that there was a very solid relationship between volume load and hypertrophy, and I mean sets times reps times load, and we saw strength naturally increasing this, we kind of had this belief that, the strength, if you're getting stronger and you're doing moderate reps, then you're getting bigger. Maybe, and that's one of those things like the statistician Box talked about, and I've said this before, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I think within person, if you see your volume load going up, that's probably a good, and you're training in moderate rep ranges with a sufficient number of exercise variation, then you're probably growing pretty effectively. But is it because the volume load's going up? Or is it just showing that you're doing sufficient volume to result in getting stronger? And now because of the three things you're multiplying, load, sets times reps, if you hold sets and reps constant, but you're lifting heavier weight, volume load goes up. So it's kind of confusing cause and effect, in that if your volume load is going up with a fixed amount of sets and reps, that means you're getting stronger, which means that there's been sufficient overload to increase strength. And hey, guess what? Hypertrophy is one of the components of strength. And if your form is relatively constant, and if you're a relatively advanced lifter and you're not making all these kind of crazy neuromuscular adaptations, if your rate coding has stayed the same, you still got the same intramuscular coordination, we can expect that something else is going on. Probably a morphological adaptation is happening. It may not be hypertrophy. It could be like, better force transmission laterally across fibers, but it's probably at least a small aspect of it is getting bigger. So it's one of those things where now, as we understand the nuance of what's going on, now, for example, we can say relatively confidently that various rep ranges produce hypertrophy, and that when you compare quote unquote hard sets, that's when that volume relationship becomes a little clearer. But now we're taking that even further. Like in the scientific literature, we're starting to see that the idea of why are we looking at it over the week? Maybe we should be looking at a per session appropriate amount of volume. And then does a frequency emerge from that? So what is the optimal combination between per session number of sets, the exercises you use, how close to failure you train, and then frequency result in the most density of stimulus you can provide in a given time period? And then if you do get that right, how often are you going to need to purposely take a deload? Because you can't get it perfectly right. And because, like you said, there's that biopsychosocial model. You could get it perfectly right, but then you walk outside and someone honks their horn at you and you get stuck in traffic and you get in a fight with your boss and you miss a meal, and all of a sudden the same input has resulted in a very different output because of the background of that biopsychosocial model is in constant flux.
Oddly specific example you gave right there, Eric, is what I'd say first.
Listen, whoever that was in that Honda Civic, I'm coming for you.
I'm fine. Don't worry. I'm finding you, and he's getting assassinated, bro. Don't worry about it.
Right.
I would say, would you agree with this notion, Eric, that sometimes we as individuals, as lifters, we have an inherent bias? So certain narratives we like to believe to be true. So we want to follow some rabbits down that hole. In other words, volume is kind of one of those neat narratives for people where it's like, to quote the immortal Yngwie Malmsteen, where it's a joke, but he played a lot of notes, neo-classical metal guitarist. And so a famous quote that he said now is, how is less more? More is more. Like, how can less be more? More is more. And as bodybuilders, as people that want to believe that our effort is going to mean something, when we hear, oh, wait a second, increase that volume, increase the gains, you're like, yeah, I'm in. As opposed to, as you said, it's like, wow, wait, no, it's way more complex than that. Slow down. But already someone's like, yeah, no, I'm a self-made. You kind of get one of those rugged individual narratives, Eric, where it's like, I'm a self-made man. I was like, okay, I don't even know what we're talking about now. Would you agree with that notion? That sometimes we chase certain rabbit holes because they're more appealing to the narratives that we tell ourselves?
Absolutely. And I think this actually goes back to the point you made earlier about what I would characterize, and from you're characterizing this way, as the shut up and lifters.
Right.
And I think in many ways, the people who are just train hard have it right, but at a much lower level of understanding than they could have.
Right.
So like I mentioned earlier, that the tendency, especially in the scientific community, who is analytical and latches onto variables. And this is good to push science forward, but it's not necessarily useful in an applied sense now for what does a bodybuilder do in the gym. If we want to explore this mechanistically in a lab, fantastic. But when you have a whole bunch of variables, and each one of those variables, as you pull those levers, is going to have some downstream effect that we may or may not know about, and then second and third order effects that may or may not be helpful or counterproductive or a feedback loop. The question is, all right, so do we try to manipulate all the variables we're aware of without knowing the potential consequences, or do we then go to the best heuristic we can at the limits of our knowledge? Yeah. So the difference between an applied researcher like myself, who's trying to figure out what is the best heuristic given what we're sure we know, without going down rabbit holes that we only know a piece of, and the shut up and lifter, is just a different level of understanding and knowledge. Yeah. But I would say they're operating off good information. So like example, most shut up and lifters, they have some people they follow. They may be following people who train with a low frequency, moderate volume, high intensity, meaning close proximity to failure, because they see that works, and it works for a lot of people. Yeah. And I'm not going to even argue with that. That is just known. And that's the way most bodybuilders train. Or they might look at someone who uses more supersets, giant sets, same kind of moderately low frequency, but a much higher volume and is slightly further away from failure, or failure is produced for more metabolic reasons. Like I'm thinking, Milo Sarchev's old videos where they do the giant sets and the IFBB pros are just throwing up in buckets, So like, and this is very going to be cultural, historical, and group specific. But if you observe a bunch of Olympic weightlifters, powerlifters, strongmen, or bodybuilders, and the vast majority of them are progressing and the vast majority of them train a certain way, or there's different camps, you can definitely say that all of those are valid. All of those, quote unquote, work. And you're not wrong. And it could be just you take that model and you train hard, and that could produce maybe 80-90% of the progress you could ever even hope to make. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are stuck forever in whatever our current culture is doing. And it also means that if we take this seriously, like you said, we want to seriously play here, right, in this ridiculous iron game that we participate in, that we love, then why not see what are the limits? Because we have evolved training over time. You do see performance in sport going up, and it seems to be going up more than just the population increase. It seems to be going up despite sometimes drug use going down in certain areas. Like we definitely know that when there was no drug regulation in the 80s, that was kind of like the renaissance of performance-enhancing drug use in strength sport. Yeah, at least now you get people who are clean of most things on game day, or they're seeing what they can get away with, not taking everything.
Yeah.
So anyway, given all of that, I think the goal is, all right, we want to invest in asymmetric risks, right? We want to set up a heuristic that we think is going to maximize the variables we know matter, but not start pulling levers where we don't know the outcome. And I think the volume conversation is a really, really good example. So there is a pretty clear relationship with volume and hypertrophy. And I would say it is a clear relationship in that you see the same relationship, but it can be right or left shifted depending on what other variables are happening. So for example, there was a couple of studies by Barballo and colleagues that came out in 2019. And these showed that there was an inverted U of volume to where doing 5 to 10 sets per week outperformed 15 to 20, which is in the exact opposite of some other studies that have found a more moderate one. So for example, Hieselgrave, they compared, I think, 9, 18, and 27 sets, and they found that 9 and 27 sets produced less hypertrophy in the biceps than 18. But then you have a recent study by, I believe, Brigado that came out, and also the study by Schoenfeld, and also the study by, I want to say, Redelier, I might be pronouncing that wrong, where they didn't even hit the top of the bell curve. They just saw increasing levels of hypertrophy as you increased volume. But there's other different variables in each one of these studies. So for example, the ones that found a very low early peak of that bell curve of 5 to 10 sets, the Barballo studies, they were in labs where they trained to true failure, not momentary, concentric failure, but like they tried to do a rep and missed it. And they rested for a couple of minutes or longer between sets to make sure they could maintain a high load and really push themselves very hard. And they had a frequency per muscle group of once per week, meaning that 20 set group did 20 sets for that muscle to failure with multiple minutes of rest between sets, all in one day.
That DOMS would be out of this world, Eric.
Absolutely. And because you're not hitting that muscle group more than once a week, you have a very poor repeated bout effect, meaning you're not sensitized to repairing damage. So that level of damage that these participants in this study were incurring was astronomical. And of course, it's going to be far past what they could accomplish in a single session. Now, you compare that to the recent study by Brigado. They had a 60-second rest period, and failure was defined by hitting a 9.5 or a 10 RPE, meaning I couldn't do another rep. But I can tell you what, going back to that Milos Sarcev example, when you got these bodybuilders doing giant sets, we're looking at IFBB pros, sometimes guys who can bench 500 pounds, and they're throwing up after doing lateral raises with 20 pounds and doing cheat reps. Because the amount of non-useful fatigue that they're generating that lead them to reach that quote-unquote 10 RPE or failure is so high. So they're getting cardiometabolic fatigue, they're getting gastric fatigue, if you will.
Yeah.
And they're probably getting some inhibition, some central inhibition from pain and fatigue that's actually limiting them. The kind of fatigue we do want from hypertrophy is local, to where you're actually fatiguing certain fibers and other ones have to come in, like taking a set of 15 to failure after you're well rested. Awesome. That's great. You're recruiting high threshold motor units because the low threshold motor units that are initially recruited are now fatiguing, aren't producing enough force to keep the movement going. So you end up recruiting everything when you go to failure. So that's an example of useful fatigue. But when you're only resting a minute between sets, and you have to do, like in this Brigado study, there was a 16, 24, and 32 set group. Can you imagine doing 16 sets in a workout with a 1 minute rest? Or 24 or 32? It's going to be such a fatiguing protocol, but not for any useful reason. So the reason why you see this kind of very clear dose-response relationship with volume there is that each one of those individual sets is so inefficient. You're not producing overload for the muscle system at least. You're basically doing cardio, right? So that means that you're making up for these really poor inefficiency by just doing more. So all I think we really know from, for example, the Brigado study that just came out is that more junk volume is better than less. But should you be doing junk volume in the first place? Should you only be resting 1 minute between sets? I can tell you what I've trained like that, and you end up using really, really light weights, terrible form, and you just want to stop. You might hit failure, but it's not because all your fibers have been adequately trained in a given muscle.
Yeah, it's an inefficient mechanism for hypertrophy. But if you do it often enough, it will be a little bit better than doing it less often. I do want to say, Eric, that much like we talk about in-group, out-group, and sometimes you'll on occasion make fun out of bodybuilders or bodybuilding the culture because it comes from a place of love. What I would say is I am a former, so let's say a reformed shut-up and lifter, and in ways still a shut-up and lifter, in that I think it depends upon your background when you enter lifting, where you come from. And I do come from a bit of an athletic background where I did some sprinting. I played a lot of soccer growing up. Baseball, I played sports, all my life. So when it comes time to go ahead and attack a workout, I like that intensity. And that's actually my buddy Joey Zatzmary, who we had on the Strongman episode. He was talking about that. One of the things that he likes where he gets a good group of guys and he kind of gets excited to lift. And so I come from that former position of not Mr. Intensity, but I like to train hard. And I like to push myself. And so I actually have to dial it back. And I gave that example in one of the previous episodes where one time back in 2013, because when I did just a little bit of programming, because I wasn't really following any program, and I did the Cohen Felipe deadlift program, which actually isn't Ed Cohen's program, but it's fine. It's like the most basic of linear periodization. There's nothing fancy. And my deadlift shot up. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to keep doing this. And I remember one time, the deadlift went in a year from like 425 to 565. Granted, I had a belt.
That's big.
I had a belt. Like I went no belt, to belt. But I remember talking about the intensity. My basic program just became a like West Side Conjugate. We're maxing out today. And I failed the deadlift of 565, holding it at above the knee, below lockout for, I think it was 8 or 10 seconds, just holding it there, refusing to let go until I fell backwards. And so for someone like myself, where the analogy I think in my head that might be helpful for some of those shut up and lifters are thinking, well, what is the utility of this? I would put forth the analogy, a diet analogy, in that if you are told you want to lean out, you need to eat clean, quote unquote, right? You need to eat chicken breast, broccoli, and rice. So you remove a lot of different food items, you simplify the process, and in that respect, you're going to be reducing your overall caloric load. You will lean out, right? So it's not saying that the clean food is superior than anything else, but by reducing calories, making sure you get sufficient protein. So you're doing some of these heuristics. Your understanding of the methodology is flawed, but the end outcome will produce a better result, kind of like quote unquote training hard. But the idea of macronutrients, so we talk about someone's pyramid. I don't know, if one of the thought leaders in the industry released some pyramids to better help us conceptualize everything, that would be fantastic. But as of yet, I don't know if we have it. But to think, yeah, Eric.
Just in case it's out there, I would go check out maybe something like muscleandstrengthpyramids.com just to see what's there. If you like what you see, buy 10.
Yeah. Give it to everyone you know. If whoever that person is, wow, they did a great job. And it helps you conceptualize it differently and more effective, where it's like, okay, wait a second. So what's actually important? Is it clean eating? No, it's calories, then it's macronutrients. And once you're armed with the proper knowledge, then you know how to manipulate it better. And I would put forth that, and you are Das Bodybuilder. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but, a clean eating, so quote unquote, if we use the analogy, clean eating, training hard, so just bringing a certain level of intensity to the gym, a certain amount of training load, all these things sufficient, cool for hypertrophy. It's like, can it get you results? Yes. Would it be optimal? Are there better ways? It's kind of like maybe bodybuilding instead of clean eating. We understand the calories are really important, macronutrients, and we manipulate those variables and we count them. So we have some way of measuring the outcome and then a way to manipulate the variable, as opposed to like, bro, you're just eating too much, like you're eating junk, you got to cut it out. It's like both can produce results, but what will produce better results over time? And I would put forth the last assertion that if you care about this thing, I mean, you're listening to a 2-hour podcast on this topic, anyone that enjoys a hobby over time, they like to increase their understanding and the complexity of their understanding in it, because you're just investing into it, You want to understand what these things are, and these can be helpful over time. So we're not saying there will be dramatic differences, but there'll be sufficient enough that over a time course of several years, the individual that thinks about all these things is able to quantify some of these variables, understand what works for them, and then manipulate them, will get better results than the person that goes to the gym, plays the Rocky tune or maybe the Rudy song in their head, and just tries to annihilate themselves.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And there's 2 key points there, is that you may get fantastic results if you use the known anecdotes as your heuristic. Because I mean, I've been advocating here for the heuristics based on what we can know for sure, what we know that does work. And I am arguing that lower down the tier of having a more robust understanding of the mechanisms of hypertrophy and the associated training variables which produce it would be the observation of people who have successfully achieved hypertrophy at a high level and what they do. Nothing wrong with that. And I'm not expecting everyone to get a PhD in muscle physiology, or even a bachelor's for that means. This is just lifting weights, right? There's nothing wrong with observing what's worked really well. it's what Omar's pointing out is that when you make false assumptions of what the underlying mechanism is, that's when you are prone to errors when you plateau. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the example used of clean eating, that the clean eating crew attributes certain magical properties to certain foods so that when they don't continue to reach progress, so they stall out in their fat loss, and they don't understand that it's simply an issue of total calories, they start making unnecessary reductions or basically getting online and figuring out, well, what do I have? Do I have the list right? Because as we know, you can look anywhere and you can find a reason not to eat a food. If you actually believed in all nutrition dogmas simultaneously, you would have nothing left to eat.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of intersections with bodybuilding, even since the very start. And here's where I'll throw some history in. You had basically two camps. One was the eat big, eat like a man, drink a gallon of milk, like kind of the origins of the GOMAD. It kind of came out of the Hoffman camp. Be a big lifter, be a big man. It's about manliness. Put down a lot of food. Eat meat, milk, butter, and lots of robust carbs. And yeah, you get some vegetables in there, whatever. But then you also had the kind of the Bernard McFadden group that was, I don't really trust the establishment. Food is the way we heal ourselves. And they're kind of like the origins of the orthorexic camp. It wasn't all bad on either camp. I'm kind of making McFadden and also Hoffman look bad. But what I'm saying is that you kind of had the like fasting, vegetarianism, eating less, seeing what you can get away with, and marveling at the body's ability to get by on very little fuel and its ability to be lean and have endogenous stores and stuff like that, and kind of looking at it from almost like this lean hunter-gatherer perspective versus the well-fed strength athlete, the guy who puts down beer every day and who throws weights over his head and then has a jolly laugh. Those are the kind of two archetypes that have been there since the damn beginning. And if you were to see that very successful athletes have come out of both camps, and with the emergence of bodybuilding and aesthetics and understanding that leanness enhances it, man, you could look online and find all kinds of stuff you're not allowed to eat. Some people, you could find someone say, hey, cheese is not on the clean food list. And you go, okay, sweet. And then okay, what about dairy in general? And then you're like, can I even have my way? And you start to get to a point where what can you eat? And then it's like, oh, maybe I can only eat fish at this point. Only certain types of fish. Oh, shit. Maybe just a rice cake. Oh, is rice cake processed? Okay, maybe I should just have brown rice. And it never ends. Yeah. And I've seen people literally spend careers, and I'm not exaggerating, never getting into peak condition because they're pulling all kinds of levers that have nothing to do with the root problem, which is that they get really, really hungry throughout the diet and they have a list of things they can eat, and they end up eating enough of clean foods that it prevents them from getting to true conditioning levels. And sometimes people can out-cardio that, and then they just look flat and stringy, or they develop an unhealthy relationship with food or overtrain or all of the above at the same time. And that's a great example. So, and you can see training elements of this as well. When someone adopts a philosophy, like you watch the anecdote of this camp makes great progress, and now I'm going to believe that they're 100% right in all cases. You kind of saw this in some of the Mike Mentzer high-intensity training camps, where he just kept drilling down with the assumption that my philosophy is correct, and that it really all does come down to maximizing intensity. So anything I can do, reduce frequency, reduce volume, those are actually problematic, and just increase the eccentric, go to failure, go past failure. And then you see, Dorian Yates stepping on the Olympia stage with like 3 torn muscles in one of his more controversial wins. Because if you listen to him, even when he's asked, like, hey, what do you do if you plateau? You've got to find some way to increase intensity. And that's not incorrect. That is a way to induce progressive overload. But if it is the only option you have and you're already incline benching 400 pounds and you're in a calorie deficit, that might cause some problems, So, and, it creates all these very interesting inversions of training philosophies to try to get to an outcome. All right, well, if I need to figure out a way to go to failure, but I'm already really strong and it hurts my knees, okay, I'll do pre-exhaust. I'll do pre-exhaust my leg extension just so I can do leg press or squats to failure with a reasonable load without blowing out my knees. And if you trace it all the way back to what's the beginning, where did that all come from? It's seeing only one avenue forward. Yeah. And that's because you're relying on an anecdote primarily. But if you understand the actual mechanisms, that's when you have more options and you can explore more outcomes. But a good point you made, and the other thing I want to cover, is that if you get too caught up in the variable and not the outcome, you can make mistakes as well. Like the whole relationship between volume and hypertrophy. Some people think that correlation is causation. And all of a sudden, the goal is not to grow. The goal is to do more volume. And like the what's the name of the metal guitarist who said how could more be less?
Yngwie Malmsteen.
So Yngwie Malmsteen actually has it right, because more is more, but more isn't necessarily better. So you might adapt to doing a crap ton of volume. But if volume was truly the key, then why aren't CrossFitters winning the Olympia, right? I think what we truly see is that there are a lot of levers to pull. Some are related more to it than others. But this is where it comes of wanting to invest in asymmetric risk. You want to set it up so that the bets you take have a potential to help you and a very low likelihood to actually set you back. And this is where some models of training I'm not a huge fan of, like large excursions in volume or pushing the limits of volume on like a weekly basis. Like you're starting at a high volume already. I know volume is related to hypertrophy. I know I need to induce quote unquote progressive overload. So I'm just going to add a set to everything every week. I'll do that for a mesocycle, reset it, and do it again. However, we've got data showing that large increases in volume, if you look at your work to rest ratio relative to where you've been, is associated with injury, illness, and we know that there's actually a U-shaped curve of volume. So how do you know you're not doing too much? Especially if you come from the ethos of bodybuilders, which is work really hard, and you trend towards doing too much. And if the lever you pull is one that could be that asymmetric risk in the wrong way, that's problematic. So I think you really want to basically have the card to play of working incredibly hard, because that's something I think everyone who listens to the podcast, and both you and I relate to, with that example of the 12-second isometric deadlift, where you're doing the Shiko movement to failure, right? But the key is to set up the best constraints with which then you apply that effort within. Not an unlimited set of constraints like volume or intensity is good. It's the pathway. It's the one truth and light. Because then pushing that one thing, pulling that lever until it breaks off, becomes problematic.
One of the, I will say, key tenets of Iron Culture is thou shalt not worship false idols. And we are attacking potentially here an individual's identity to be serious, where if someone thinks to themselves, well, I'm a hard worker, like I worked hard for this body, and you're challenging the assumption that more isn't better, that more, they think more is better, and you're saying, well, that might not be the case, then,
more is more.
Yeah,
I agree with you there.
Yeah, more is more. And I think sometimes when we see what tends to stick in individuals, we have to be aware of our own bias. And that's sometimes where science can help sort our shit out, where it keeps us humble, where we say, well, okay, well, is there any research backing this up? What is actually going on here? And we're no longer following blind dogma. And so what I will say to you, Eric, let's get into this conversation about periodization for hypertrophy and maybe the utility. We'll get some definitions worked up. I want to play the role of the devil's advocate. I'm going to be your foil here. I'm going to parrot what, let's say, pro-periodization for hypertrophy, what I've heard has been said by individuals, and I'll let you respond. Before we go on, though, do you think it'd be helpful to quickly define, because we define programming, where essentially it's components of a periodization, but instead of the macrocycle, we're talking about the meso microcycle, and that programming largely for hypertrophy, it makes sense. Can we talk briefly? We had a great episode to conceptualize. If you haven't listened to it, I'm blanking on which number it is, but with Brian Miner, all about progressive overload. Do you think it'd be helpful to quickly define the last remaining P before we get into the conversation about periodization for hypertrophy?
Yes. So we've been mired in philosophy and in theory here, but we are going to actually get into reviewing some research and talking about what makes sense and what asymmetric risk you should invest in. Yeah. But first, we have to have the correct underpinning of our understanding of those three Ps. So I think we've got periodization. Yep. I think we've understood programming, and I'll explain based on the literature why we probably want to focus more on programming, and that only some elements of periodization are tangential and helpful for kind of maybe resensitization, recovery, or just dealing with the biopsychosocial reality of stress and fitness and fatigue from periodization, but they're not core key elements. So programming, short-term manipulations, periodization, manipulation of variables over time. Progressive overload, it's the thing we think we all understand. The problem where lifters get caught up in this is people say, hey, I use progressive overload. You don't use progressive overload. That doesn't mean just adding more weight to the bar. It doesn't even mean adding more sets. I think a really useful way to conceptualize what progressive overload is just to take the word progressive out and realize that if you induce overload, there should be an adaptation if you can adapt, right? And if that overload occurs, that means, in the context of resistance training for hypertrophy and strength, and specifically hypertrophy, that you're going to have a bigger muscle. And we know that if all else is equal, if that bigger muscle includes more contractile tissue, which in the way you probably should be training, it will, you should be able to produce more force, which means you're stronger. So it's essentially understanding that progressive overload is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. That when you induce overload, that means you've done sufficient work of whatever combination of variables you're doing to produce overload. So you're creating an adaptation. And that the fact that you got stronger is not just the thing that is going to induce further overload because you're using heavier loads, but it's also primarily telling you something. It's your body going, yep, you're doing enough. So sometimes people get it mixed up and they push the volume, intensity, frequency, or whatever variable way too quickly, fast, and high because they think, all right, now that I'm stronger, I've got to use this heavier load all the time. But the reality is there's a pretty wide bracket of what is sufficient to overload. There might be a plus or minus 10 sets per week per muscle group that you could use, and probably a plus or minus 20 kilo, 30 kilo load, really getting anywhere within the realm of failure, So a single at a 7 RPE is lighter than a single at a 10 RPE, but both are going to produce a lot of strength adaptations. Likewise, doing 3 by 10 at an 8 RPE and doing 5 by 10 at a 10 RPE are going to produce obviously a little more stimulus in the latter example, but a lot closer than you think. So you could effectively use the knowledge that you are getting stronger to gauge whether or not you're producing sufficient overload, rather than seeing it as, I've now set the bar higher, I've got to do more, or literally within months, you're going to be doing a non-sustainable level of training. You're going to be training 4 hours a day and going to failure on every set and be actually regressing and probably injured.
I don't regress, my friend. I only progress. I will say I like the Boolean logic, the if-then statements, and I'll give you one. If I train calves, then Eric will disown me. And that's why I don't. You just got to keep things simple.
You have that completely opposite.
What?
I told you that we were only going to keep this going if you train calves. But it's interesting how you inverted that.
No, that's just my understanding. I think there's just, the time difference. You're a day ahead, so I had to flip it back. And it's kind of like one of those things where you take a look at a word in a mirror, you get a whole different meaning.
Right. So if you look at race car in a mirror, it's the word race car backwards.
Yeah, that's Ross car.
Right.
Yeah, it's a different word. Yeah, so we agree. Fantastic.
It's a different word. You're right.
Yeah, thank you.
Which in Serbian means don't train calves, of course.
Yes. And I'm glad we could reach that agreement, because now let us talk about what the literature currently shows. So how much we understand as of yet, because again, you said it's emerging in terms of what the research is showing. But let's talk about the data. So trying to manipulate all these variables to get a better outcome for hypertrophy, periodization, what does it show?
Exactly. So this is not a unresearched topic, but it's an example of when if you don't ask the right question, you're not going to get a sufficient answer. So there have been, I think, one systematic review and one meta-analysis done by Gurgic, and I'm trying to remember the other author. At least one was done by, they might have been both done by Gurgic, which is probably why I can't remember the other author. But they were in the last couple of years, and in both cases, they were looking at which periodization models produce the most hypertrophy. So largely comparing linear versus undulating models, because those are the dominant types that you see in the research. And they found that neither one seemed to be superior for producing hypertrophy. And there are even some individual studies where what might not be considered periodized programs have performed just as well for hypertrophy as programs that are considered periodized. So again, it's just simply another way to like if you look at some of the meta-analyses on periodization, they will define a periodized program based on whether or not the number of sets or rep ranges changes over time. So if you have, let's say, fixed number of sets, fixed number of reps, and you just train to failure and let your loads go up as you adapt, that wouldn't be considered periodized. It has progressive overload, but it's not technically periodized. And when you compare periodized to non-periodized programs, there hasn't been a meta-analysis of that for hypertrophy that I've seen, but it does clearly show that it's better for strength when you have that element of linearity. However, I can remember one specific study where they compared the Hatfield model. The Hatfield model, for those who aren't aware, Fred Hatfield, the original Dr. Squat, He was one of the first people who wrote about periodization for hypertrophy and taking a scientific approach, very popular in the 80s and 90s. Very intelligent guy as well. And, if there's something that he has argued for that is not proven by modern science, it's not a knock on him. It's just saying he was using science from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, or actually 30 years ago now. So the Hatfield model was essentially arguing that, hey, there may be fiber type specific hypertrophy, which is probably something we'll talk more about in this podcast, and that it could be achieved by using different loads, rest periods, tempos, and basically focusing on the characteristics of slow and fast twitch fibers. And that the way to get maximum muscle growth, since you could argue, although there's some data to the contrary, that to some degree you have a fixed amount of fast and slow twitch fibers even after training effects. You want to hypertrophy them all. You want to get global hypertrophy across the spectrum. So when you look at fiber type differences in a power lifter or an Olympic lifter versus a bodybuilder, you typically see more slower oxidative type fibers that are larger, and a greater proportion of that cross-sectional area is more. It's more basically spread out across the fiber type spectrum than you see in a strength athlete, which is a lot more dominant towards fast twitch, right? So anyway, his approach that was then empirically tested in the study I'm referencing was to train in each one of those different rep ranges in a single workout. So that the individual workout is supposed to maximize hypertrophy by ensuring that all fiber types are fully trained, fatigued, and stimulated. And then you do that again when you recover, right? It was compared to the same 3 rep range zones and tempo and intensity ranges, right? So there's slightly differences, like shorter rest, higher reps, slower tempo, and then more explosive, heavier lifting. But anyway, so basically 3 different rep ranges, tempo, and rest period combinations trained in the same session or for a week at a time. So essentially comparing the original Hatfield within session model, non-periodized, because like I said, these are the same rep ranges all the time, every single day, and you just go up and load when you can, compared to a weekly undulating version of that, where you would do each one of those categories for a whole week and then repeat it. So now we're comparing periodized versus non-periodized, and you could make the argument that that weekly undulating model, one potentiates the next, the whole phase potentiation concept in periodization, therefore it's going to be better. But that's not what happened, at least for hypertrophy, because again, phase potentiation probably makes a lot more sense for the end outcome of getting stronger or more powerful. But for the purpose of just inducing hypertrophy, which maybe have to do more to do with the total effective workload, didn't seem to make a difference how you spread it out, whether it was all in one session or week to week to week. So we've got basically a study and a couple reviews. And the problem with the reviews, where you go, all right, so I know I should periodize, but it doesn't matter whether I do linear or undulating, is that neither linear nor undulating periodization is designed to enhance hypertrophy. So you're looking at a bunch of periodization studies designed to enhance power or strength, and then just seeing which one also happened to influence hypertrophy. And I think that's not really a useful question. Like, what's the best way to get better at tennis? Playing baseball or swimming? Yeah, it didn't seem to be much of a difference. It's like, that doesn't tell you anything. So that's kind of the state of the literature. We have some examples where a non-periodized but reasonable program that has overload in it produces just as much hypertrophy as a similar total work periodized program. And then we have research showing that the model doesn't seem to make a difference, especially when it's matched for total volume.
Now, I am going to go on a slight tangent because I want to go back to Dr. Squat, and I just want to ask Eric a question. Have you seen the video of Dr. Squat and his disciples? Just yes or no?
Absolutely. You're talking about the one where he does the squat off with Tom Platz?
Yeah, so there's that one, and then there's like a home video. Anyone just search Dr. Hatfield squat, maybe even seminar. It's where he has his disciples, Eric. So this is like the original muscle worship, and I'm not even knocking the guy. But I remember, so there's an individual, shout out to Jeremy, a powerlifter that goes to Forest Fitness, insanely strong, had the record of 220 pounds all time. Really strong guy. And so, his...
220 pounds of what?
Just pure Greek god.
Oh, no. So he had the all-time record, and he was 220 pounds.
Yeah, sorry. He was 220
Gotcha.
pounds, and he had, I think it was 21-23 was his total at 220.
Wow.
Yeah, he's all right. So a lot of Dr. Squat, because he was a well-regarded person. One, Dr. Squat. Two, he was a very strong individual. Some of the strength principles, but he told me one time, he's like, yeah, just check this out. And there is a YouTube video, I do want to find it, of him with his disciples, and he's lifting, and for some reason, Eric, well, not some reason, he's shirtless. But he's also out of breath while he's talking to his, I'm just going to call it disciples. And they're sitting down. And the way the camera films him, it's kind of like a angled up. So they're worshiping him. And he's also out of breath. And he's shirtless. And he's like, so the thing I'm like, this, like, there was no one on that day while filming that thought, maybe we want to change this. Like, I know we joke about muscle worship, but we don't want to change this. It's fantastic. It is just something from the culture, a novelty if anyone wants to check it out. Side tangent over. That's it. That's all I want to say.
It's just a post-training Q&A in a place that didn't have air conditioning. I think you're being way too judgmental, Omar.
No, it's fantastic. But let's then talk, Eric, about the practical implications for someone. So the real question that we're asking is how to maximize hypertrophy, because what we're trying to say is a periodization useful in order to get better results for building muscle? And once again, we're saying at this moment in time it's tenuous because it might not necessarily be a great fit. But here's some of the question, or let me parrot what some people say first, because then there's multiple paths we could go down. So while the data might not be there, well, we just don't know. So there's many unknowns, as you would say. If we periodize for hypertrophy, much like periodizing for strength, there's a few things that might occur that if we can recognize that as individuals, we'll tend to let our ego get in the way. And so we'll kind of that faulty notion of progressive overload. We'll just continuously, Eric, over time, we'll try and lift more and more and more. That periodization gives the average lifter some semblance of structure that allows them to understand how to better overall train for hypertrophy. So instead of just going to the gym and quote unquote training hard, we're now given recommendations and there's many ways that you could periodize for hypertrophy. You could manipulate overall volume, as you said, different rep ranges that you go through. There's many different ways, but by manipulating some of these variables over a long time course, someone would say that, it will yield better results because it systemizes the process for an individual to better understand what is most important when it comes to getting bigger. And that is cycling, volume, intensity, and frequency to produce a desired outcome. And the second thing that I've heard parroted by individuals is that it also might reduce, if we can agree that increased volume over time, or handling more volume maybe than the body is used to, is one of the things that can be injurious, where it increases the risk of injury. That if we just systemize and once again we periodize the approach where we manipulate some of those variables, they'll have better end outcomes for the average lifter. Go, Eric.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable underlying statement, and people saying that if we can systematically manipulate the variables we know are associated with hypertrophy, that can produce something effective. There's a couple other things that go into periodization as well. One of them is the concept of variation and novelty, and these are slightly murky because I would say that variation can be confused or applied in a way that looks a little more like randomness. And I think that's not the same thing. And novelty can also be applied in ways that might not have a physiological rationale, like just change something. And when you apply those things together, you can get faulty concepts like muscle confusion or something like that. And then, of course, if we're going to create variability, over what time course is that appropriate and when? And do we need to actually change the exercise, or can we just change the rep range? And then why would that improve things? So there was another study, and I'm blanking on the name, that it just recently came out. I think we covered it in Mass in 2019, where they compared variation within a session or over a more protracted time period for hypertrophy, and there didn't seem to be a difference. But it was like controlled for the total amount of variation. It's like changing a lot all in one session or doing it over time. No difference. However, there are studies showing that too limited of an exercise selection can be detrimental to proportionate hypertrophy. There's a classic study where they compared an equated number of sets of either just Smith machine squats or Smith machine squats, lunges, deadlifts, and one other exercise that I can't remember for the lower body. And they saw more complete hypertrophy across all heads of the quadricep in the group that did more exercises, meaning that you wouldn't just do Smith machine squats to grow your quads. And that makes sense from some of the things we know about the anatomy of the rectus femoris and other things as well. So, okay. So if we need new stresses sometimes, or if that can aid things, or at the very least, if we don't believe that variation or novelty is an indirect or is a direct stimulus, it could be indirectly helpful because there's a lot of data showing that different loads, different manipulations of the same exercise, different joint angles, different ranges of motion can all produce different hypertrophy. And regional hypertrophy is definitely a real thing. There's a lot of shit we just say, quote unquote, in the evidence-based community where we think we're immune to kind of these repeated things that become bro science because we're the quote unquote evidence-based community. But the reality is not every single person who tries to follow an evidence-based philosophy is digging into the research every day. And a lot of them are just parroting things from people they trust who they know are doing that. And I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that, but each person needs to remember to kind of check the claims they make, question their assumptions from time to time, and make sure they're staying up to date. And there was this kind of just meme that existed from the time I was around, this cultural thing of like, hey, muscles only do two things. It's very simple. They get bigger or smaller. And pretty much they just grow from end to end. And that's actually so well disproven and completely not evidence-based, it's not even funny. I mean, we've got stuff going way back showing regional hypertrophy, changes in EMG with changes in grip, or angle. We know that tension goes along force lines, and that in compound movements, different muscle groups contribute. There's studies showing that you can get peak activation in the chest during a bench press at very low loads in trained lifters, and that maybe the triceps only come in once you get towards failure or with heavier loads where they're quote unquote needed. So you manipulate load, you manipulate range of motion, exercise selection, grip width, grip position, underhand versus overhand versus neutral grip, etc. And you will get slightly different variations in the activation and purportedly what you would think would be the resultant hypertrophy. And I think there's historical evidence for this as well. Before bench presses were invented, and if you just look at the physiques where the manly lift, quote unquote, or the thing that used to replace how much you bench bro was how much do you press. Mm-hmm. You saw a lot more development in the delts and the traps and the lumbar, because to get that barbell up to where you're pressing it, it started on the floor. Yeah. So almost everything was some kind of variation of a clean and press, clean and jerk, or continental clean and press, or etc. But something from getting a weight off the ground over your head. And you saw a different pattern of hypertrophy pretty reliably, where you kind of saw these flatter pecs, even in people who had a robust amount of total development. So anyway, what I'm getting at is that this is one of those scenarios where trying to handle all the variables is difficult. So the kind of heuristic we get to is, well, shit, we probably shouldn't have too little variety in our exercise selection. And how do we solve that? Well, at the very least, we know we should be doing more movements than say, a power lifter or an Olympic lifter. We need to be training in multiple planes. Kind of the heuristic I like to use is having the big six, which would be a horizontal press, a horizontal pull, a vertical press, a vertical pull, some type of hip hinge, and some type of squat. And that hip hinge could be a fucking back extension. It could be a hip thrust. It could be a deadlift. It could be a good morning. And that quote-unquote squat could be lunges. It could be leg press. It could be front squat. It could be a hack squat. It could be a back squat. But just moving through those patterns and getting all of those is kind of like, all right, that's my baseline position to start. And then I fill in little gaps where we know things about anatomy. Like I'm probably not going to hit the short head of my hamstring if I don't do an actual leg curl movement. That bicep femoris is probably not going to get a whole lot of work. So maybe I should do some leg curls as well. The medial and the rear delt, probably not getting maybe enough work from rows and pull downs and presses. So I throw some of that additional delt work in. Maybe I do some core work, and maybe I do some direct bicep work if I'm not doing enough pull downs and I'm doing more rows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's kind of what the bodybuilder's approach should look like. And then you go, well, all right, if we don't know that variation and novelty and the data doesn't support that changing it all the time or even frequently is necessary, but we know it's important, well, maybe we do that on like a mesocycle-based basis, because we don't want to get to the point where we're actually impeding our motor learning. So there's other research out there that shows like there's a cool study on untrained women where they did leg press and bicep curls for 10 weeks. And the cool thing here is they didn't just do pre and post testing. They did a midway test. And they found that strength went up in both movements at the midway point, but only the biceps hypertrophied. And it took the full, I think, 8 or 10 week period before you saw lower body hypertrophy from the leg press. And that's because now you're dealing with a more complex movement. It's compound. So you're both you need inter and intramuscular coordination to do a leg press, while a bicep curl you can learn within a couple sessions. Yeah. So you're not efficient enough of the movement to actually generate hypertrophy. So most of that strength you saw at that midway point was due to neuromuscular adaptations. So if we're in this stage where we're creating so much exercise variety, and we believe in the muscle confusion principle, where we actually want to be unfamiliar with movements that we use, and that's how often, and to the frequency and to the magnitude that we're rotating movements, we're actually creating a lack of familiarity, that can impede hypertrophy. So it's kind of like, that's an example of an asymmetric risk. We don't want to go too far down the murky area of variety and novelty, but we need to make sure that we have enough variety in the movements we do to create global hypertrophy. We don't want to just kind of rigidly follow the Olympic lifters and powerlifters who are like, hey, we're pretty big, just do this. It's like, well, you're pretty big, but you don't have pecs. And you're pretty big, but you don't really have any medial delts.
No, Eric's response would be, you're pretty big, but you're not this big. And then he just busts out the biceps. Like, so shut your ass up. It's like, because let's be honest, in the Iron Jungle, size speaks before everything else. We don't care what your body can do. It's really what it looks like it can do. Is that fair, Eric?
I'd say that is the key to the Iron game right there.
Yeah. It's like a classic. We take a look once again at the animal kingdom, and we'll have more about a masculinity in crisis tour at the end of this episode. But it's about trying to pure threatening, so trying to pure swole rather than actually doing anything with it. I must say that I did have a lovely image in my head when you're talking about the exercise variations, where this is not a fair comparison at all, and there's so many different variables we could talk about, but we kind of have that novice lifter. So you have two people, once again, and I made videos on this topic, just the person that follows maybe, and this isn't a knock against starting strength whatsoever, but they follow a lower volume program, right? That's based around compound movements. So you have person A that follows a lower volume strength-based program to get stronger, right? It's like, that's what they want to do. Cool. Okay, they do that. And then you have the gym bro that goes in and they select movements where it's a lot more localized fatigue, where you don't have to become proficient at the movement. So you do a chest fly, right? You do a machine chest fly. There's not an 8-week adaptation period, Your body's like, hey, bring your arm from here to here, closer to the midline, good to go, bro. And they do, more volume. So again, I'm totally agreeing. There's so many more variables, but then you look after a year, because Greg is, that's why I said I could never do a podcast with Greg, because we would just shit talk. Like, we would just, joke around incessantly, and Eric helped steer the ship forward. A little bit. He sent me a, I don't know what we're talking about, but a starting strength. And again, I'm not knocking starting strength, but body transformations of like a 1-year transformation. It's just randomly years ago, and it's not representative of the program, blah, blah, blah. But the poor individuals, like, it's a lower volume program and they're trying to become proficient at the lift. It's like, if your sole goal, well, it's called starting strength, someone would say their goal is not hypertrophy, so shut your ass up. I'm like, okay, with that being said, we're taking shirts off and we're just taking a look at what happened over a year. And whoo, that person that stuck with those big compound lifts and didn't do a lot of volume, compared to Jim Bro that, did a lot of localized fatigue. Wow. But it's about the long game, and it's about so many things.
And GoMad probably didn't help either.
Yeah. There's so many ways to go off of that. But that's interesting, Eric, where you said the 10-week study of individuals were, once again, doing a bicep curl where it took a shorter time to induce hypertrophy than it did on the leg press. There are a lot of things to consider, and maybe something that I want to talk about then would be, what about the athlete that's not just trying to get swole? So we're talking now about periodization, and this is just one of the side questions to go down. But you, me, both of us, you and I together, forever and ever, we want to maybe get strong, and we maybe want to, get swole. How important then is it periodization for hypertrophy if it's one of the components that we want to improve. So how then do we manipulate some of these variables if we're not just about maximum swollenness? So if we could maybe agree that periodization for hypertrophy is kind of tenuous and maybe there's some benefits, but as of yet, what we currently see in the literature, how does it then apply for someone that is, let's use it once again, quote unquote, a power builder, bro? Someone that's not just pure hypertrophy. How does the discussion or conversation change?
Yeah, I think that's where the beauty of hypertrophy being a very forgiving adaptation can be leveraged. So what I mean by that is there's a reason why you can find people with almost like this, both camps still include lifting weights, but polar opposite philosophies to how to get swole. That's why you can see Mike Menser standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they're both huge. And, probably in the pre-anabolic steroid era, you saw a little less heterogeneity between training programs between jacked individuals. But there, even in the natural ranks, you will see people who use vastly different volumes, rep ranges, and exercises. There are people who believe you got to isolate things, people who just use compounds, and they might be standing next to each other with a 1-point difference in their overall score come WNBF Worlds Finals, right? So the reason why it's so forgiving is because essentially it is, did you do enough contractions at a high enough effort and a high enough load, which doesn't actually have that high of a load that you need to do. High reps and low reps both work. But if you want to get stronger, you have to lift heavy weight. Yeah. And everyone who argues about how to best get stronger is talking about different ways to lift heavy weight. Yeah. Do you lift heavy weight all the time? Or just at the end of the cycle? Do you lift heavy weight with slight variations in the main movement? Or just the main movement? But come on. I think you can position, Shaiko versus Westside and feel like they're very different. But if you talk to anyone who's outside of the powerlifting community, the observation of what that looks like is, so that's not the same training style. No. See that band on there? Totally different. And they're like, sure, because they're not part of the in group. But if I grab anyone off the street and I told them, yeah, this guy trains twice per week for an hour and a half, each time going to absolute failure and then getting forced reps. This guy trains 4 times a week for 2 hours each session. And they'd be like, oh, wow, that's really different. You can take the extreme examples that still seem to be within the realm of at least producing progress. I'm not going to call them optimal by any means, but can help you actually get bigger. And you can position them and make them look very different. But in strength sport, there's always the non-negotiable of you're going to lift heavy weights. Even if you're just repeating the actual competition. Like if you just decided to do a mock meet on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's still going to look quite similar to traditional training, to the novice and the person who's not at all familiar with it. So given we have more data and a better understanding of what is useful for periodization for strength, and we know that it doesn't make a difference, quote unquote, compared to other models, and it's not harmful. Having a linear model, unless you spend a really, really long time with low volume, is not going to hurt someone who's trying to maximize hypertrophy. Then why not? Just basically take the overall general periodization concepts for maximizing strength, but then layer in some accessory work. Yeah. I think sometimes where you do see people run into problems is when they think, okay, cool, I'm a power builder. That means I just need to train like a bodybuilder with the big 3. Is they forget that the squat, the bench, and the deadlift are not the greatest vehicles for hypertrophy. If the goal is to induce fatigue and do relatively higher workloads, those are pretty bottlenecked. Not everyone is built in the way that some of these really high-level powerlifters are. Like if you take a look at, Bryce Lewis, Russell Orhe, Taylor Atwood, Steffi Cohen, Brett Gibbs, they all have really, really nice proportions biomechanically, limb lengths for doing the big 3, for staying upright in a squat, for staying upright in a deadlift, for hip hinging really well. They don't have really, really long limbs in any certain way. There are some powerlifters who do really well who are great at deadlifting, but they have to fold over in a squat. And then their bench is quite low because it's a long distance to travel because of how long their arms are. So when you look at these kind of perfect specimens of powerlifting, yes, they get a much lower fatigue per unit of volume with the big 3, and that's probably why they're so good, or at least part of it. But if you look at yourself and you end up in this folded over good morning style position when you squat, Do you really think that's the best way to build your quads by doing 20 sets of that per week? Probably not. And also, the relationship between volume and strength is a lot weaker. When you look at some of the meta-analyses there, the effect size differences between different bands of volume, say like 1 to 5, 6 to 9, and 10 plus sets for volume, there's only a difference when you're like less than 5 or in like the 10 plus range. But in hypertrophy, it's a much more graded dose response. So basically, the most closely related variable to strength is load. Even doing 5 singles a week, and nothing else, which is an extremely low volume program, could be argued to produce in the realm of potentially optimal strength gains for a mesocycle or two. Just maxing out and then doing back off work in a completely different exercise is very viable. So I think in general, you probably want to choose which movements am I, quote unquote, a power builder for? What are the things I care about getting stronger on? And then you take a more minimalist in terms of volume and frequency approach towards those movements. And you take some of the templates that are out there for a power lifter, where you're not crushing yourself with like 6x5 3 days per week or something like that. And then you fill in with copious amounts of bodybuilding work. That way, you're kind of hitting it at both ends of the spectrum, and you're not attempting to shoehorn one or the other into a position where it could be detrimental. I think that's probably the best approach. And that's actually a video we talked about back when I was in Toronto, the first time we met up. Kind of the idea of starting with the heavy single and then doing accessory work for hypertrophy, if you're trying to get the best of both worlds with the least amount of fatigue.
I was thinking in my head, Eric, and I'm like, damn it, he's right. When you talk about those lifters, like you look at a Bryce Lewis, and I look at that boy, I'm like, man, he tick. Like he's definitely going to be lifting mad weight. You know what I think, Eric, when I look at you lifting weight?
He's going to get hurt.
That's an elegant man. I hope he doesn't hurt himself. I think your new moniker, lifting moniker, should be the elegant gentleman. It's just like even how you carry yourself and everything. It's like, hello, good sir. And then we got Bryce. I'm like, he is going to sumo the shit out of this deadlift, and it's just going to look like a one-piece pickup. I think that is an important point. Would you agree, Eric, that one of the beneficial functions of getting stronger for natural athletes that are looking, also to get more swole, it helps them conceptualize progress in general? Because it is kind of sexy to be like, oh, you know what? Like I just squatted 300 pounds instead of like, hey, psst, Eric, psst, bro, on the leg extension, 165 times 12, new rep PR. What's up?
Yeah, it's funny. I do think that the exposure of bodybuilders to some of powerlifting culture is more helpful than it's harmful.
Yeah.
Because there's like, the whole idea that I can manipulate these variables, that I can take the same degree of attention that I do with nutrition to training, that it's not just do a lot of work and train hard, and that I could potentially set up my training to be more optimal. That's great. I think some of those concepts and some of those elements are really useful. And if they were coming from the whole isolation, localized fatigue based approach, I think you can take that too far. If you look at the way that bodybuilders train today, it happened right around the time that Nautilus came out and promoted the idea of isolation as a marketing means to get people to use machines. Like, hey, how could you ever expect to hypertrophy all your muscle groups if you're not doing these machines that we've perfectly built to train these specific muscle groups? And guess what also came out in the 60s? Anabolic steroids. And everyone's like, hey, this isolation thing is great. Like, that might be it. Or it might be the D-ball.
I was going to say LSD, but yeah. We said,
LSD.
You said, guess what came out in the 60s? LSD.
A lot of things came out in the 60s. In the bodybuilding community specifically, the emergence of the Nautilus machines, the concept of isolation, and anabolic steroids overlap. And that's when you started seeing split routines become very popular. And this is also when Weider popularized bodybuilding as a completely separate entity than strength sport. But if you go back to when people were just observing when they had less machines to use, it would always be based around rows, presses, squats, with also, of course, don't get me wrong, some curls, some extensions, and all kinds of pullovers and other accessory movements. And it's not to say that machines are bad or you should only use free weights, but it's to say that your body is made to move and it doesn't naturally isolate things. And this idea that if you understand more variables, again, going back to this, that if you can manipulate them all, that would be optimal. It might be better to have a healthy collection of compounds as the base of your program, because we know that for you to do hip extension and knee extension at the same time, you're probably going to, with a heavy load and supporting it on your back, that you're going to be training a lot of the muscles at the same time. Now, there's a trade-off there. It's going to be training all the muscles in your body, so it's going to be inducing a lot of systemic fatigue. So you don't want to be on one end of the spectrum where you're trying to just do squat, bench, deadlift, row, overhead press, and nothing else. And you don't want to be on the other end of the spectrum where you're trying to isolate your brachialis on Tuesday, you know? So essentially it is, I need some bread and butter movements, and those can be very useful ways to efficiently train a lot of muscle groups at the same time, and to know that I can't outguess my body and try to train my ubulus anterior. It's not a real thing, by the way.
But you said it, so it's got to be real, man.
Now it's real.
Eric, we're now going to discover a new muscle. We'll discover it.
It's the dorsal ubulus anterior. Figure that one out. So the idea is that you probably want to be in the sweet spot of not inducing too much fatigue, getting enough stimulus, but also not leaving anything out by trying to outsmart your body and isolate things to the nth degree.
Yeah, and I just want to say that should Eric or myself compete at that strongman competition, I can guarantee one thing: we will be the best looking athletes there. And by we, I mean Eric. I will be there to admire him. But we're a package deal. So what I mean when I say that, if he rises, we all rise. Everyone on this ship rises together.
Yeah, and if you farmer's walk, deadlift, overhead press, or any of the things that I know you're stronger than me at, I get to take credit for those lifts, just like you get to take credit for the way I look.
Baby, that's us. That's
between the two of us. There's an above average strength and physique athlete.
That's what I'm saying. Hey,
solidly C+. I'm talking.
And I'm just saying that if we were ever to go to World's Strongest Man, you bet your ass that myself and Eric would primarily critique the physiques of the competitors and not their actual lifts. It's like, man, Hafthor's looking soft. Like, what did he sodium load before the competition today, Eric?
Bring back Marius. That's the only true champion. Yeah.
We just wear shirts that say that. That's like our only.
Yeah, bring Marius back. He's like, I'm fighting right now, and I'm way too old. I don't want to do this.
I'm fighting and I'm losing. I do want to give a little analogy right here. And I'm going to give Francis Ford Coppola, I'm going to do his voice a little bit. I'm going to say, all right, picture this, okay? You're Akira Kurosawa, and the film's called Dreams, and you're talking about Van Gogh, and Marty Scorsese, my buddy, is playing Van Gogh. And you think to yourself, okay, you understand all the variables here. You have, 5, 6, 7 colors. Okay, that's cool. And you want to paint yourself a pretty picture. Okay. But it's only 5, 6 colors. If you understand all these other variables, well, you got a whole other palette. Okay, you got, instead of 5, 6, you got 30, 40, you can combine them. There are more tools at your disposal to paint, and your body is the painting.
So this is the really roundabout way to ask me to summarize potentially which variable should be manipulated.
I didn't. No, Eric, we're like, you want to thank the sponsors?
We don't have them yet, but how about instead of thanking sponsors, maybe I could just summarize. Thanks.
Yeah, boy.
Okay, first. Periodization, as the most fundamental core tenet, is simply the manipulation of variables over time. This can be broken down into programming and periodization, where periodization is typically talking about longer-term periods, maybe at the macrocycle level, mesocycle, and microcycle. And programming is primarily what we deal with when we're talking about programs, to manipulating acute variables rather than big picture volume and intensity over time, things like training frequency, exercise selection, rest periods, etc., number of sets, rep range, all that stuff, load on the bar. Programming is largely where we know we can make a beneficial difference for hypertrophy. If we progress load over time to ensure we're keeping up with progressive overload, remember, we're not inducing it necessarily or only. And if we manipulate volume over time, we've seen this pretty robustly in training studies, which are always 1 to 2 mesocycles long, almost exclusively. That can enhance hypertrophy. So largely we're dealing with programming. And then if we go back to the episode with Brian Miner and we understand the underpinning philosophy of overload, that we don't have to cause progressive overload necessarily, but that we can assess whether or not we're producing an adequate stimulus by whether or not we're getting stronger in the context of a hypertrophy program across multiple lifts and even some isolation movements, then we're probably growing. And then we have to think about investing in asymmetric risks. So if we make these very, very large volume excursions, we can potentially go over that U-shaped curve and end up on the other side. So what is important for periodization for bodybuilding is focusing on the mesocycle level, focusing on week-to-week changes. And what elements of periodization might be useful are things like deloads, so repeated periods of low stress, because if we are pushing the envelope to ensure we're doing enough to get optimal gains, we invariably, because of the biopsychosocial model, maybe just overshooting a little bit, maybe because we're overzealous, maybe because we have other stresses in our lives, we might end up doing too much. So semi-periodic phases of deloads, which also might have tangential benefits, like things like resensitization, which we aren't really sure is a thing, preventing quote-unquote anabolic resistance, which we aren't really sure is a thing in this context, but there's no harm in it, and it certainly allows us to dump fatigue and to continue to overload. And then having an appropriate amount of exercise variety and training across a spectrum of rep ranges will maximize all the potential variables without potentially causing any harm. And we want to start in the realm of what probably makes sense for volume, intensity, and frequency. And really quickly to summarize that, that's training literally anywhere in the 6 to 20 rep range, anywhere between, say, 4, 5 reps from failure all the way up to failure, depending on the volume in the session, the order of exercises, whether it's compound, high risk, or a technical movement. And then doing at least probably 10 to 20 sets per muscle group over the course of the week, and training each muscle group at least twice per week, so no single session has a ton of volume. If you do all of that, you're effectively maximizing all known quantities for periodization for hypertrophy. And then you can just allow your loads to progress. And when your loads don't progress, that's when you can assess whether you need to assess the fatigue side of it. Do I need a deload? Or am I feeling fine, but I'm not progressing? Is that when I should pull that volume lever rather than pulling it preemptively?
Now, you know what is probably the most uncomfortable aspect of everything you just said, Eric?
The way I look in your eyes while I say it?
No. See, you think I'm going to joke, but I'm actually going to be serious. And that is to find what is best for an individual takes some experimentation, and it takes understanding the feedback loops of yourself. Well, how did I respond to this? How can I change this? Well, what stress am I currently undergoing? Well, what does that mean then for my training? And sometimes when we try and go for those neat answers, right, where as you joked off camera, was like chest, 12 to 14 sets per week. We're done here, kid. Like, that's what you need. You know what I mean? Where we want these neat answers that we could just apply, rather than it's like, well, wait a sec, how does this actually apply to me as a person? Because lifters aren't a monolith, right? We all don't have the same recoverability, the same genetics, the same life stressors, the training. Like, there are more things to make us different, or I would say unique, not to try and separate individuals, to make us unique, than there are often that unite us. There are underlying principles that we can follow, but if we want to bring about our best physique or our best self, however we try and define that as an athlete, as a bodybuilder, then we have to get into the nitty gritty, and we have to be diligent with all those variables and what we're doing. Not to say that we're going to turn this into a massive Excel spreadsheet, and it's like, okay, what was the color of my poop today? Like, we're not trying to analyze every single variable, but it takes some work on our own. And that's something that's scary, to understand that if we want, so you're crushing it at the gym, you also have to be self-aware enough to analyze what's going on large scale with everything in order to try and bring about the best possible changes. And that's a scary notion.
I think it is. And it leads people down pitfalls, like the whole thing of, we feel that the more concrete answer than we can truly, if we're honest with what data we have, provide, is a safety blanket. Yeah. And that's okay if it's just a safety blanket. Like if you read somewhere that the quote unquote MAV is, like you said, 10 to 14 sets on chest per week, and you start there's probably no harm, because that's, 10 to 20 sets is it's within the literature. And we can pretend we know that the chest requires 10 to 14. And again, these are completely randomly generated numbers. This isn't representative of anyone's position, so don't look that up. Yeah. But just know that's all it is. We don't know that, and you are going to have to figure it out for yourself. And I think what often goes hand in hand with looking for these answers that don't exist is having the grass is greener mentality, kind of having that supplement industry influenced idea of greater gains are just around the corner if I can find the key, if I can find that one magic trick. And cultists, let me tell you, because I know if you're listening to Iron Culture, you're not a novice. You're probably someone who's been lifting for a while. The difference between you making optimal gains and making gains at all that are measurable and noticeable by you is almost infinitesimal. And if you're progressing, my advice is don't look for the grass to be greener. Don't think that optimal is around the corner. Don't keep changing variables or try to do more. You know something. And that's basically your pen light in the darkness. In my opinion, and I'm going to make a great analogy to go back to Mike T's analogy. You've got this pen light. You've got a slowly evolving cave. And right now, you're actually getting closer and closer to your goal. Let's say there's a light at the end of this cave, and it's getting brighter. And this pen light is your saving salvation. The pen light is saying, hey, this is my program right now, and it's working. I'm getting closer. The idea of thinking that there is some more optimal pathways to go, you know what? I'm going to throw this pen light out and just turn it off and throw it behind you without looking, and then expecting to find another pen light on the way there. You have no guarantee you're going to find it. Yeah. And you may not have a light whatsoever. So do not let go of that pen light. Because until it actually sputters and dies and the battery goes dead, that's when you shouldn't be looking for another light.
See, and the real topic of this episode, which I love, you neatly gave an analogy that's apt, would be that we're fighting the encroaching darkness. We're here to say that, hey, there's a void, but buddy, it's okay. It's a full void. Like, we're going to help you out here. We're going to try and arm you with the tools. And what we want you to know is that you can get out. Maybe not all of you are going to get out, but at the very least, some of you, and those are going to get out. Hey, here's looking at you.
Some of you won't make gains, but you know what? If you're listening to Iron Culture Podcast, that ain't you.
Yeah,
because you got the keys.
Oh man, I got to give a shout out to that natural bodybuilder. I'm blanking on his last name, Sam. He was in a Jeff Nippard video, but it's just fantastic. Some of the people that listen.
Sam Okinola.
Yes.
Prior heavyweight champion, second place this year, fantastic bodybuilder.
Yeah, shout out to him. Or he was just like, he left a comment and then he sent me a DM. I'm like, this dude is swole as hell. It's like when you just see the range of individuals, and that's why I do like to say that lifters aren't a monolith. When we think about this and conceptualize this, like you could have a champion of champions listening to this, trying to understand, and then also, as you said, Eric, it's like, hey, if it's working for you, like, are you getting results? Are you enjoying your time? And also, hey, here's a underrepresented variable. How's your enjoyment in the gym? Not that you're supposed to go into the gym every single time, like, oh, I'm having the best time in the world. It's like, but are you enjoying the process with how you currently have set up your training? You're getting results. Oh, that's fantastic.
Are you passionate about your training?
Yeah.
I think people hear enjoyment. They feel like, again, that whole serious play thing that people struggle with.
Yeah.
I think when you hear enjoyment and adherence, you feel like those are words for non-serious people. Right. Here's a word you might connect with more. Are you passionate about your training right now?
Yeah.
Because if you are and you're getting results, I think what Omar's getting at is, why in the world would you change it? No. That's foolish. Because all of us are in this cave, and some of us are struggling to even get the light to turn on. Like, man, there's been years where all I'm doing is smacking that flashlight and it's not turning on.
Yeah.
Or there's been other years where I'm smacking the flashlight too much to get it to turn on that I eventually hurt my hand.
And then you just sit down. And then what Eric didn't finish is, once you throw away that pen light, you sit down in the cave because now it's utterly dark, and you just wait for the darkness to encroach upon you. So he gave you the solution. He's like, hey man, we got you. Keep moving forward. Oh no, he's gone. It's like you're watching a horror movie and they make that critical choice, that error, where it's like, hey babe, you want to get out of this house? It's like, no, I think we'll be okay. It's like, that was, nope, they're done. Like, yes. At that moment, they're done.
Ironically, when the couple stays in the house when the walls are bleeding, that is the equivalent to you not staying with the program that works,
yes,
and getting on some website and going, I wonder what this influencer thinks I should be doing.
Yeah.
That's you staying in the house that the walls are bleeding. Don't do that.
Oh yeah, that their rhetoric, and I got to do it because where would Iron Culture be if we weren't rife with analogies? And I'm going to give one more because I'm a huge fan of it, and it heavily inspired Star Wars, and that is Hidden Fortress, where there's two characters. So essentially, Eric, without ruining it, without spoiler alerts for anyone, there's two characters that are the C-3PO and the R2-D2 of this film. Okay, so it's another character we saw, another classic. But basically, one of the fundamental things, one of the lessons in the movie is they're destitute, they're always on the run, and they're always basically fearing getting caught or arrested again, a bunch of things. They're kind of vagrants. And on occasion, they will have dumb luck occur to them. So their misfortune will turn into fortune, where it should happen that something comes towards them where they get a little gold or they get out of a precarious situation and they'll be very thankful for one another and they're like, oh my God. But they won't use this lesson to sharpen up. So they won't say like, okay, like I nearly died. Now I'm no longer going to die. Oh, wait, I have a chance to become filthy rich. Like, let me go with this route. They were continuously making the wrong choices. So they're remaining the same person rather than learning from their mistakes. And that is lifting. Don't do so. And I'm sure Eric would agree with this. Don't do calf raises is what we're saying. Like 1, 2, don't do that. Boom. I just love how we agree, Eric, and we're always same page. Same page, different book, some might say, but bro, page 290.
Yep, you're in the references. I'm actually reading something of substance. I love it.
Yeah.
It's good.
There we go. Now, is there anything that you felt, Eric, in this conversation that we should circle back to clarify? Anything that our target audience, because we do have an audience and we have to be aware of said audience, what they need to hear versus what maybe, once again, a complete novice needs to hear? Anything that we should circle back to?
Man, it's a tough one because I think this was a very, very conceptual podcast, and that's kind of the nature of periodization. I think the main take homes you want are that remember that almost, actually not even almost, all of the periodization literature that exists, both peer reviewed and non peer reviewed, is theoretical in nature. And then all of the empirical testing of it is looking at 1 to 2 mesocycles, 6 months at most, and it's largely only applicable to the variables they tested. It's almost each study where they compare this 8-week periodization program to this one, it's not even testing those periodization theories. It's testing that iteration of it. So if you see a study that says, hey, block periodization outperformed daily undulating, guess what? I guarantee you I could write a program for each and make one shitty and one good where it would go the exact opposite way. Or a quote-unquote non-periodized plan that would be better than a periodized plan if you just did it quote-unquote wrong or suboptimally. So remember that periodization is useful conceptually and that we're trying to deal with the combinations of the logistics and practicalities and the physiology and how that goes over time, because we are kind of dealing with a black box of our body and only knowing what the output is. And we're trying to basically make sure that we are balancing fatigue versus fitness or stimulus versus recovery and getting the outcome over time to ensure progress. So just remember that don't believe in things when it comes to periodization. Understand it conceptually and then try to integrate some of those concepts for programming into it for hypertrophy. But just don't set yourself up in a position where you have to gamble on a potential unknown.
Talking all things swole, you mentioned black box, which is kind of timely and relevant. And so I think it's at this point where I feel comfortable announcing what's really important in life. We've reached the end of the podcast. Keep in mind, folks, that we're waging a war. So our body would be our armor, okay, that we're going into battle with. And we're entering the battle of all battles for our eternal soul, where there's a masculinity that is facing, Eric, right now, a key crisis. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
I think masculinity has been in crisis for a long time.
Yeah.
And somebody's got to do something about it.
Yeah. And who would be better than 2 hard bodybuilders?
2 rock hard bodybuilders.
Yeah. No.
I think, I don't disagree.
Yeah,
Tell them.
So just stay tuned. Okay, we've obviously been leading up to this. It's that's the primary function of Iron Culture. The secondary is maybe to give some knowledge of utility and help you conceptualize your training or like whatever. But waging the war 2021, it's going to happen, and we're both stoked. So Eric, let me ask you, because you were a guest and a host on this episode, where can people find you?
Well, if they want to find me, they can find me with Omar.
Yeah.
On Iron Culture, and we're available on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, and anywhere where a voice calls out and says, what is it to be a man? And we say, hey, we'll lead the pack. Yeah. We're alpha. We'll tell you. Yeah. And it is looking to us, stroking our egos, and knowing that you are inferior in our presence, but outside of our presence, we can teach you to lead a pack, because, of course, as we know, primates are pack animals, and primates are always led by one dominant male. There can only be one. And if you've seen the nature documentary, The Highlander, then you know this to be true.
Yeah, it that basically was just something. So the way I like to think about it is that the Highlander is a tachyon transmission. So it went faster than the speed of light. So in that way, it was able to go from the future into the past and inform us of what was to come. So we're basically just preparing myself and Eric where there could only be one. I will say there was that website. The name escapes me. The Art of Manliness or something. That we're gonna sue them because we're the art of manliestness. But that's yeah, it was hard. It was hard to spell it, but we just want to assert once again. Anything that is at the top of the food chain must continuously remind everyone else around them that they are in fact at the top of said food chain. So that's all we're doing at the end. Don't be alarmed, anyone. Don't feel threatened. That's just our natural musk.
And if you are threatened, know that's because we're dominant. And I think with that, this quantum entangled podcast with the Highlander through tachyon emissions can come to a close now that you understand nothing about what we're talking about now, but hopefully something about periodization for hypertrophy. I think we can close it out.
Yeah, man. I'll just say that I want to thank every single person for listening to this episode, continuing to support us. It's been damn near a year, and we've had an exciting journey. If you enjoy this podcast, you could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. I do read them on occasion. Do you, Eric?
I read them every day, twice a day, and it actually takes away from my work and family life.
So if you want Eric to have an even more dysfunctional life, go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. On YouTube, we do our best to respond to comments, so go ahead. Let us know, because I actually got to say that this idea, when I approached Eric, it was straight from the culture, where we had another episode. I'm trying to remember what we did one, and then someone said, hey, love the podcast. What? And they said, what would be great is talk about periodization for hypertrophy. And that is what led us to this episode. So go ahead. We read the comments. We appreciate everyone. And we'll catch everyone that next episode every single Monday.